Well, I want to welcome everyone to our session on teacher compensation education on unequal opportunity. I'm Kate Bahn. I'm the Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And I was very excited to be invited to chair and be a discussant for this session, but I was not part of organizing it. So thank you to the folks who put together the session. First, we'll have a presentation by Sylvia Allegretto, who's the co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at UC Berkeley, and she's presenting her work with Mishel on trends in teacher wages and compensation penalties through 2019. Following that, we'll go to you, Eunice, if you think that makes sense following the order of the program. Eunice Hahn is an assistant professor of economics at University of Utah, and she will present on teacher compensation and student performance. And then finally, Patrice, Mareschal, and Jeff Keefe. Patrice is an associate professor of public policy and administration at Rutgers, and Patrice, you're presenting, correct? Yep. She'll present her joint work with Jeff on better pay and unequal opportunity. I'll offer some brief discussant comments following all three presentations, and then I'll open it up to audience questions.
Okay, great. So I'll take this over. So hi everyone, it's nice to be here with such a great group. Thanks again, Kate. You've chaired before these sessions, which is great to have you. So look, I'm going to present our paper that Larry and I put out, I think in September of last year, that updated our trends in teacher pay and teacher wage and compensation up to through 2019. We've been doing this work since the first book we put out was in 2004. And we were sounding the alarm then, and we're certainly more alarmed now, because the erosion of teacher pay is not just an issue of fairness, and it is an issue of fairness, but teachers are the most important school-based determinant of learning. And really importantly, that we don't talk about enough, is that they have the future in front of them every single day. So it's hard to overstate the responsibility and importance of this profession. So let me just get into it so we can get through things here. I think we're going to hold our talk to about 10 minutes, I think. This is what we do. You know, we've done this a lot, but we look at CPS data. We now look at a pool of public school teachers and other college graduates, meaning we now only include other workers who have at least a BA degree or more. And that's because teachers now have to have a BA degree. We don't do that in the much earlier work where we use the decennial census. And we only look at those who are highly attached to the labor force. So you have to work at least 35 hours a week. This makes the distribution of weeks work pretty similar across the two groups. We look at weekly wages. We think this handles the summers off issue. And by the way, we've done this hourly wages, annual wages. Things are always a little bit different, but what does not change is that the trend gets more negative. The pay gap, the negative pay gap for teachers gets more negative in all of these. So that's pretty convincing. Summers off, by the way, it's not clear that this is a real draw to the profession anymore. As the wages of men have kind of waned over time, as the share of family income coming from women is much larger than it's ever been. This is really important, that it's the earnings that seem to matter the most. Also, if you look at the data we have of second jobs, you see these big spikes in second jobs in the summer months for teachers. And also there's a lot of teachers that take jobs during the year. So it's not clear that that's such a draw. And then we pull 5 years of CPS data. So we have ample data to do some individual state estimates of the teacher wage gaps. Then we're going to do a benefits adjustment using the ECEC, the employer cost per employee compensation data, to do a benefits adjustment, and then we'll go from there. So basically, look, the teachers are heavily female dominated. It's pretty amazing that the share of teachers today is not much different than it was in 1960, over 70% women. In our sample, we only have BA or more now, but even within education, you see that teachers are more likely to have a master's degree, but less likely to have a professional or a PhD. So this is why we also do regression adjusted analysis, because there's all these other factors that we want to take into account. But first, let's just take a quick look. Oh, one more thing, I just wanted to throw this in here because we haven't really talked about this much in a lot of the work we've done in the past. And that's that we have almost no, a serious lack of diversity in teaching. So all of these bars that have men and women, women in green, the share of women in green and blue for men, they all add up to 100. So this is what the teaching profession in the country looks like. It's over-dominated by white women. By about 60% of all teachers are white women. And we have a real lack of diversity for men within each group, but also even just teachers in general of color. I just wanted to kind of point that out. So let's look at our underlying data. I think it's always interesting to look at this. I'm going to focus mostly on this CPS data from 1996 onward, even though I'm just going to show you the long-term trend here. Basically, it's for the people in the weeds here. This is the issue of the 1994 redesign, the fact that the two dotted lines represent 2 years where we can't identify BLS allocated wage data. And this is actually pretty fascinating. We write about it elsewhere, that we only use data that's actually reported by the surveys, the workers themselves, because there's this bias that artificially limits the pay gap by assigning wages to other college graduates that are too low systematically and too high for teachers systematically. But the other thing I like to point out here is just how post the 2001 recession, that even the wages of college grads stagnated. These are real wages until we finally get through the Great Recession, and in 2014, this kink here, that's when they start to grow again for other college graduates, and then we see a pretty flat trend in teacher pay. So these are the data that we're going to exploit to run a regression, wage equation on, to see what the actual relative pay gap is for teachers. So again, I'm going to concentrate in this first slide on the post 1994 redesign for the CPS, and we see that look for women, who are dominating the profession, they were almost at parity in the mid 1990s, right? And then you have this longward trend, increasing trend downward till you hit the 2007 recession, where you kind of see some back and forth, and then you see another very long steep trend and increase. So these are negative numbers. So this is the teacher pays making less relative to other college graduates and all of these numbers. Overall, you see it goes from -6 in 1996 to -19. For men, which might be explaining why they're not coming in droves to the profession, goes from -15% relative pay gap to just over 30%. Now, people want to make a big deal about this last uptick in 2019. Did it have to do with the 2018-19 teacher strikes? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's embedded in the data here to whatever degree that teacher pay was addressed at that time period. But there's a lot of stuff going on here that dictate these trends as far as what's going on with wage growth. And we see other times, even in this graph, where you have upticks where the pay gap gets a little bit less, but it never sustains itself, right? So time will tell, and I'll be running the new data for 2020 very soon of what's going to happen here. So if we look at a much, much longer time period, then we really see what has happened in teacher pay. So this is when we went back in our 2004 book, and we actually looked at the 1960 and 1970 census, decennial census, ran a similar wage equations. And we see for women had a premium, right? In 1960, if you were a teacher, you made about 15% more. And then that just systematically erodes to what we see in the new data for 2009 from the other slide, that it's now -13%. So an almost 30 percentage point decline in relative wages of teachers. Interesting enough, in 1960, if you're a woman, you had 2 years of college, 1/3 of them were elementary and secondary teachers. If you had 4 years of college, 63% were teachers. So the good news is early on you had a premium. The bad news is we just didn't let teachers do very much else. Those are the opportunity costs that have grown so substantially that is helping to really drive a lot of this ever increasing teacher pay gap. And today, less than 1 in 10 women choose teaching as a profession. So let me see where we're at here. I don't have much time, so let me just say that here are the teacher pay gaps by state. And again, here they're in blue, and you see some of the largest teacher pay gaps are where we saw some of the teacher actions a few years ago. These are, again, pulled data, so adding 1 more year of data doesn't change them much in the short run. And let me just quickly get to some benefits. So our benefits adjustment, basically, these red lines are our estimated teacher pay gaps. That's the weekly wage gap. And then we do the ECEC data with professionals, again, not against all other workers, because most teachers or all of the other workers most of them don't have BA degrees, and all teachers have at least BA degrees. So we're trying to do an apples to apples comparison when we're going to adjust for benefits. So when you take the red weekly wage penalty against the green estimated premium that teachers get on their benefits, you get total compensation gaps that look like this over time. So for the most recent year, it's the total compensation gap is just over 10%. So again, we're seeing a long-term erosion. We're seeing some improvements. This has to do with a lot of work done at EPI that's showing that the penalty has implications for recruitment, retention, turnover, again, pointing to those opportunity costs of women over time. The pipeline is drying up. Pay is one of the top reasons why students of today are not choosing teaching at a profession. And in general, we have to do what the best practices in other countries are doing, and that is to elevate the profession. And public education in general, and certainly the teaching profession, to make it prestigious, selective, competitive, and very high paying. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Eunice, do you want to go next?
Sure. There you go. All right. So I think the Sylvia's presentation set a really good background information for my presentation. So the transition is going to be pretty smooth. So my paper is looking at the relationship between teacher compensation and student performance at the district level. And as we saw, the teachers facing teacher wage penalty. So the immediate question is probably then, should we raise teacher compensation so that we don't really have penalty anymore? Will that increase student performance or not? So that's kind of the following a question, and then that's what it is. This paper is about. And I'm drawing my evidence from the national data on districts' finance and students' standardized test scores in both math and English. So again, I don't have to talk much about the background because Sylvia already went through it. The reasons for this paper is that there's been lack of direct evidence between teacher pay and students' educational outcomes. There are some studies done on this topic, but the evidence is very mixed, either positive or negative. Sometimes it's not significant at all. The major reason for that lack of evidence is probably because we don't have good data set to exploit. We want to use the national level data in many cases to draw the national policy, but we didn't have a national data so far. My data is national level, although national level data has pros and cons, right? But I still have a national data, so with I can fill this knowledge gap and try to provide more informed decision for policymakers. And direct research questions on this topic is, I just want to see how the teacher compensation plays any role in impacting or affecting students' test scores. And there are two related sub-questions that addresses educational inequality. One is, what's happening to the students' racial and ethnic groups? The second one is, what about district's socioeconomic status? Does it have anything to do with the impact of teachers' compensation on the test scores? Bunch of literature, they're evaluating the channels, how the teacher salary can impact educational performance. Well, so we can talk about how teacher salaries can bring higher quality students to the education sector to begin with, or teacher salary can reduce the teacher turnovers, and in turn, it can change the educational outcomes. Or you can even talk about other channels like, what about teacher salaries? Just bringing high quality people and then remaining the high quality people in the educational sector and then build the reputation of being a teacher, which we don't seem to have anymore. So that's going to be a kind of long-term trend. But all of this literature is talking about channels, but not on the direct evidence between teacher pay and the educational outcome. So that's what I'm trying to come in here. The data that I use is publicly available. One is Local Education Agency Finance Survey, and it actually has a nickname, F33. And the other one is the Stanford Education Data Archive, so we call it SEDA. I combine these two together, so we have a panel on national data. The SDFS has the annual fiscal data, both the revenue and the district expenditure for all US school districts, which is publicly available. And the SEDA data is also publicly available, and then it provides the outcome variable for me. It's average achievement test scores for both English and math between 3rd and then 8th grade. And the data I have, it actually finishes at 2015, but the new version of SEDA is actually launching this Wednesday, and it's going to go up to 2018. So we can actually update it. But this paper is on the revision, so I can change that now. All right, so by linking the two data set, again, I have the panel data on district level. So basic diagram looks like this. So if I look at the math score with the teacher salary spending on each district, it's weekly positive, both math and English. And of course, this pattern is kind of spurious, right? We can just picking up the relationship between whether affluent districts paying more, and so the student score is higher, right? So we can't really say the higher salary is leading to the test score just based on this diagram. So we'll have to do the regression analysis. So I have two different methods. One is simply the state fixed effect. The other one is district fixed effect. So, we can talk about the details later, but my first attempt to control for all the compounding variable is that, just throw in all the compounding variable that we can have. So that's the first attempt. And then based on that, I can also add the state dummies so we can try to tease out the state variation. Even with the state variation, we still have this different trend and different characteristics within each state, because each district may have different philosophy or background, or it's kind of a different mechanism behind the public education. So we can also use the district fixed effect to control for all those. The good news with the district fixed effect is that we are able to control for unobservable factors that can also influence both outcome variable and the input variable. So when I use the district fixed effect, I, with caution, can claim a causation. So that's one of the benefits. But again, because this is not a national, it's not quasi-experiments, some people will still say, well, we don't really have a causation. But roughly speaking, with the district fixed effect, I can kind of claim causation. With the national level data, combined with the district fixed effect, the benefits of this study design is that we can claim with causation, and then we can see how this broad finding can talk to the policymakers overall. So the results from the state fixed effect, as we expected, is the positive. So if district spends more on teacher salaries, their test scores of the students has positive impact. The problem though is the magnitude is really small. So the magnitude of this positive relationship under the state fixed effect is if you increase the district spending on teacher salary by 10%, that is associated with 0.52 points higher math score and about 0.5 points higher English score. So in the impact size, it's about 0.04 in standard deviation, which is really small. So based on this, will I make a suggestion in the public policy that we should raise the teacher's salary? Yes and no. The impact size is too small, so I can't really sell this. But this does not mean that the raising teacher salary is not going to make any change because, well, I'll talk about it in a minute because we talked about different channels, and some of the channels is actually in the long run. We'll have to bring the high quality students to the education sector to begin with, and we have to grow that into the teachers, and then that they have to make an impact on the students' lives. So that's going to take a long time. So this finding is not really speaking about raising teacher salary is really not that meaningful. It's not that. It's just at this point with the data telling this impact size is not so big. Another finding with the state fixed effect is that the teacher's salary and the district performance, the relationship between the two, they vary a lot by students' race and ethnicity. So Sylvia mentioned about how the lack of diversity in teachers' body, lack of diversity in student body is not bad, but the impact of teacher salary on their performance is really different. In terms of math, the higher teacher salary expenditure is positively linked with student performance for all student subgroups except Asian students. Asian students do not really care about whether teachers getting higher pay or not. They do really well no matter what. For English, the positive relationship exists for all subgroups teachers. This relationship doesn't really stay this way once I have the district fixed effect. So here the district fixed effect, once I have a district fixed effect, the coefficient becomes even smaller. So now we have a 0.3 points higher math and English score. And used to be 0.5, right? Now it's down to the 0.3. So the impact is teeny tiny. And here we see the white students are the biggest beneficiary of the higher teacher salary. I was hoping to see the other way around, that the minority students are getting a bigger impact, but it was actually the opposite. So our students, if you're a minority, you're not really getting big impact of higher teacher compensation, which is kind of concerning because we were hoping that this is going to be one of the channels that they can fix the education inequality among minorities, but we don't see that. Then the next question is, as Sylvia mentioned, we also need to talk about teacher benefits because a lot of people think that the teachers are becoming teachers because they know the salary is abysmal, but the benefits great, and then they have summers off, right? So there's a reason why we have to talk about the compensating differential. What I find is that there's no compensating differential between wages and benefits. If your district's paying higher salaries to teachers, you're also the district paying more in benefits. So higher paying salary is associated with higher paying benefits. So this means that we will have to look at the total compensation, not just the salary, but total compensation, which is the sum of benefits and salaries. So the next one is looking at the total compensation, not just the salary. Once I look at the total compensation expenditure instead of just a salary expenditure, the magnitude between magnitude of the coefficient of this relationship actually got shrunk, which means the benefits itself is not really contributing to the positive performance of the students. So when we look at the total compensation, because the magnitude of the relationship decreases, that probably means that If you have an option to raise the salary or to raise the benefit, raising the salary is probably a better option if the goal is to increase the student performance. What I see is for the math, the positive relationship between total compensation and test scores is only statistically significant for white students. And for English, I see the positive relationship between the total compensation and test scores for all racial and ethnic students. So again, I again see the benefits shared more among white students. What about the SES status? And we want to know about whether this kind of policy that raising the teacher salary is making it better off for students in the high SS group or the low SS group. If you want to see more solvable solution for the education inequality, you want to see the impact of teacher salary is bigger on the low SES districts. That's not what I see. Actually, I see the opposite. For both measures of teacher pay, salary and total expenditure, the high SES districts gain more from the higher teacher compensation. For the low SES districts, I don't really see any impacts from the teacher salary increase. So again, this is not a good news if you want to look at this increase in teacher compensation as a way of addressing the education inequality. Then what do we do? So a couple of takeouts though. We know that the magnitude of the positive coefficient for total compensation is much smaller than those for the salary expenditure. That's signaling that the returns to the investment on non-wage benefit could be even negative. So giving more non-wage benefits to teachers while holding salary is not a good strategy if your goal is to raise the student performance. The other discussion point is that the effect of total compensation expenditure on district performance, again, it's not really seen in the low SES districts. Why would that be? I have other papers that show similar patterns that I would look at the union effects on student performance, and that union effects does not show in the low SES districts. So one of the reasons might be there should be some sort of threshold for required condition to make everything work. So if the low SS district does not have those qualifications met, then maybe doing all this kind of policy choices or policy intervention can be useless, which also means that we will probably have to set the standard straight before trying to do anything else in those districts. My other slides are just kind of showing the details of the table. So I think this is it.
Thanks, Eunice. And Patrice, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so in our paper, we focus on the ways that home rule perpetuates inequalities for both educational personnel and students in New Jersey. So the legal mechanism of home rule or localism allows citizens in higher SES, predominantly white suburbs, to engage in opportunity hoarding to protect their educational spaces. Opportunity hoarding results in large racial and socioeconomic based gaps in academic performance, inequitable distribution of skilled teachers across schools, and it puts low-income, historically underserved populations of students at a disadvantage. So we posed two research questions. First, how does localism impact educational inequality in New Jersey? And second, what is the impact of localism on teachers' salaries?
And so to understand inequality in New Jersey, it's important to review the legal history. Over the past 50 years, New Jersey's Supreme Court has attempted to redress educational inequality produced by home rule. And educational opportunity in New Jersey is rooted in constitutional provisions that require the legislature to provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public schools for the instruction of all children. However, it was not until 1973 in Robinson versus Cahill that the state clarified the content of the educational opportunity that the thorough and efficient clause requires. And here, the court defined educational opportunity as that needed to equip a child for his role as a citizen and a competitor in the labor market. And so in this case, the court ruled that New Jersey's reliance on local property taxes to fund the state's public schools produced gross disparities in per pupil expenditures. This led the legislature to enact the Public School Education Act of 1975, which created a new state funding formula. Several years later, in 1981, Abbott versus Burke was filed by the Education Law Center. And again, this case challenged the over-reliance on local taxes to fund schools. The New Jersey Supreme Court has since made 21 Abbott decisions on behalf of low-income children in 31 school districts between 1985 and 2019. The goal of the litigation was to equalize spending between the poorest and wealthiest districts by increasing state support of property poor districts. And these tended to be located in old industrial cities with the characteristics listed here: low SES, urban, evidence of failure, large percentage of disadvantaged students, excessive tax for municipal services, and a large percent of students of color. In the fifth iteration of Abbott, the New Jersey Supreme Court moved past equalizing school financing and ordered a series of reforms for Abbott districts. This included whole school reform, full day kindergarten and preschool, comprehensive program for facilities improvements, and supplemental programs in a variety of areas, including health and social services, technological alternative education, school to work programs, and after school and summer school programs. So this takes us into the data and analysis, and my colleague Jeff Keefe is going to take over from here.
Thank you, Patrice. Basically, New Jersey has some very unique features. Depending on the rating agency, it's considered to have the best public school system in the country. It goes back and forth with the state of Massachusetts in those rankings. On the other hand, what makes it truly unique, I think, is the fact that it has 600 school districts in which it allocates 1.4 million children. There are 584 operating school districts that have 2,000 elementary schools, and charter schools never fully got off the ground. They only exist in the urban areas, and there are 88 charter schools in New Jersey. The demographics of the public schools: 41% white, 15% Black, 31% Hispanic, and 11% Asian. For the most part, the suburbs, the wealthy suburbs of New Jersey, are white. So what we're going to use is look at is an evaluation of certified education personnel. And what we have is individual data from the New Jersey Department of Education that provide annual earnings by the individual who has a certification. We have their level of education, their years of education experience in New Jersey, and other demographic factors. To control for socioeconomic status, the state back in 1975 created something they refer to as the district factor grouping. And it's a principal component analysis of 7 or 8 indices that evaluate socioeconomic status of a school district. And they range from 1 through 10 or A through J. So what they use the district factor grouping is they place all schools in a district group and then compare across to see if their performance is improving in relation to their peers. So what we're going to do is run regressions, wage equations on the schools here, on the districts by individual, and we'll run OLS in a multi-level analyses, basically using a human capital framework. And we'll have a variety of control variables, including grade level and teacher subject of specialization. Now, in terms of what the state Supreme Court has done, it should be remembered that they have sought to equalize per capita student dollars from the richest to the poorest communities. So they're using state funds to contribute to the education in those 31 districts to equalize them financially with the wealthiest 150 school districts in the state. So they use the wealthiest 100 school districts as a benchmark and then insist that the state contribute to those 31 school districts to create a level playing field between these urban school districts and the wealthy suburban school districts. So with the district factor groups here, 2 through 8, 1 being omitted, what you can see is that as you move up to the wealthier communities, teachers earn more money. And that is true for all educators, and that is also true for teachers. And so the reallocation of resources still allow more affluent communities to recruit. And let's face it, the conditions of employment in a wealthy community for a teacher is a lot better than conditions of employment in an urban school district. So while New Jersey has made considerable efforts to address the inequality, much more than most states in the country, and they certainly have eliminated some of the worst disadvantages to the property poor urban minority districts, the persistence of the separate or local home rule of 600 school districts has allowed us to maintain a highly unequal school system. And you can look at any of the tests, particularly what just recently came out with the SAT test. Tremendous inequality across these school districts about who's most likely to succeed in college. And not only do the more affluent schools have the ability to recruit by paying a premium to educators, but they also offer a variety of activities that we just don't see in the urban school districts. Now, my daughter worked in an urban school district, so I have the anecdotal advantage of her telling me how much they spend just on security measures to keep the children safe every day in the school, which consumes basically their extra activity. Their school activity budgets are consumed by security and security staff. So while New Jersey has made a separate, has made separate equal, it still is separate but unequal. And without consolidation, it's unlikely to change. And it is political suicide for anyone in New Jersey, a local mayor or a local superintendent, to recommend consolidation. People want to retain control over their communities and their schools, because it directly affects their housing values and their taxes. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Jeff and Patrice, for that, and thank you to all the speakers. So I have a couple sort of a summary of all the different talks, and then a couple different sort of comments and questions on these, particularly like policy conclusions and digging into that a little bit more. But overall, they were really great papers, so there was not too much constructive for me to offer because I thought they were all really great, straightforward papers with really good data. But just to go through all three talks and how I see them sort of linking to each other is sort of the first fact that we know that teachers are persistently underpaid and it appears to have gotten worse over time. The second is that at the current levels of salaries and benefits, higher pay only seems to have a modest effect on education outcomes, and the effects seem to be greater for already advantaged students. And then finally, equalizing expenditures for education does not fully offset the inequality in school resources. So I was thinking, overall, it seems as though maybe the effect of pay on education outcomes and the effect on equalizing expenditures might be muted due to the extent of lower pay already, just that the pay is so low. And so this might be sort of evidence of low labor supply elasticity for teachers, which would work in two directions, that pay cuts or lack of raises may not induce too many teachers to quit, but on the other side of that, if they have low labor supply elasticity, you need even sort of greater pay increases to encourage more labor supply and encourage more job tenure. So that's the opposite, is that if you increase the pay just a little bit, you're not going to suddenly it's not a competitive model. You're not going to get everyone else flooding to those jobs. We need to increase it that much more. The one sort of side note, and I'd be happy for people to dig into this too, I thought it was a little curious that we had this one paper on New Jersey looking at these different sort of efforts to equalize expenditures. And then Sylvia and Larry's work also shows how New Jersey actually has one of the lowest teacher pay penalties compared to other jobs. So I just thought that was interesting. New Jersey is a state where teachers make relatively closer to other sort of similarly qualified workers. So I'll go through each paper in order, sort of what I thought of them. So Sylvia and Larry's work continues to be really important for many reasons, for the reasons they've always been important, that education is highlighted as a critical tool for improving people's outcomes, but then we don't actually devote any resources to making people's education better. So that seems sort of, not an oxymoron, but it's a little bit frustrating, at least, that we tout something as the primary tool for people improving people's future outcomes, but then don't actually help them get access to high quality education. And then the second one is about how income inequality and job polarization overall is exacerbated by low paying caring professions, which are an increasing portion of the overall labor market. And so if we could do something like improve the pay conditions for teachers in particular, it's sort of one of probably the biggest care work occupations alongside maybe some healthcare occupations. It might help affect these sort of overall trends for income inequality and job polarization that are led by care work jobs. Be curious your thoughts on that. And then my questions are, like, is it accurate that there's not broad political will to increase teacher pay? Why doesn't this issue get more attention when I feel like it should? Lack of broad political will notwithstanding, teacher labor movements are promising in this extent. But as you know, that you can't get at whether those teacher labor movements were the cause of the slight convergence we saw last year prior to the years before that. I'm also really curious about why the variation between states is so huge. I mean, it ranges from 2% to almost 40%. So that's just such a big stark difference. How much of this is influenced by the industry and occupational composition with states? So what is explaining that? Or are there other things that I'm not thinking of? And I also thought it was kind of funny that the three states with the lowest penalty are three states I don't think I've ever seen grouped together in economic measures. It was something like New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Wyoming, or correct me if I'm wrong, but they're just like three states that I never see paired together. And so I was curious about that. And for Eunice's paper, just reiterating your findings that the effect of pay on education quality is positive and significant, but pretty limited. The conclusions are to consider sufficient school resources and community resources. So I was curious whether you could, if there's any evidence you know of, or there's a way to get at sort of the joint distribution of school and community resources alongside teacher pay. Are they synergistic? Do they sort of have outcome effects? If you have both in a sufficient measure, they have outcome effects that would be even greater than the sum of their parts. So I'm really curious, if from other research or from your own, if there's a way to get at that. And can you tease out the pathways behind higher teacher pay and better outcomes? Is it through higher quality supply of teachers or increased tenure of the teachers? Because we know that teacher quality tends to go up with more tenure. And you also sort of note that there are limitations on education quality as measured by standardized testing. So what other factors can we look at to understand the myriad of ways that people benefit from quality education and devoted teaching labor forces? So, high school graduation rates, civic engagement, upward mobility. Are there other measures we can look at to think about if we pay teachers more? Maybe they're not teaching to the test, but maybe they're still providing a high quality service to those students. And so how can we think through that? And then finally, the last paper on New Jersey. So I know that you talked about the Abbott and Burke case, which I thought was really interesting because it examines inequality between school districts and had reforms that went into practice afterwards, but it was limited because it didn't talk about equality of outcomes in education, which means that there's not a progressive funding structure. And it seems like that is really a critical impetus to having a progressive funding structure. So more progressive than it is now, not just equalized, is if the outcome is actually going to be the goal of equitable education outcomes. I was curious whether you try interacting district factors with years of work experience. So similar to the comment I made for Eunice, is the reason that there are different outcomes in different school districts is because there's much lower tenure or higher churn at some of these school districts that serves lower SES populations, and how that might affect things. And what do you see, sort of a policy question, what do you see as the practical and political limitations of developing a progressive funding structure? Who supports it and who doesn't support it? More progressive funding would foster equitable growth, I think. It would be good for the broad economy, but I also could see a world in which there are different parties who all may care a lot about public education, but may not want to do something like concede control over funding in a progressive structure to the federal government, say. Like I could see it being pretty likely that localities and states may not want funding to be more filtered through the federal system. So those are my couple of questions I have for all of you.
Yeah, by the way, I'm not hiding here. I just can't turn on my video because I've been booted by the co-host or something like that. But you're right, the bottom three, which I always get these questions. Okay, start my video. This new technology, Zoom, is really, tech is hard. So you have New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Wyoming have the smallest pay gaps. Look, I've started to do this, I think about a year, maybe more longer, who knows at this point. It was probably 3 years ago now. There's two moving parts to all of this, right? There's the other college grads and how wage trends are, and the public teachers. I think in Wyoming, everybody's like, Wyoming's great, that's where you should teach, because actually I don't think the pay gap was statistically significant. I think that was the one. Maybe Rhode Island wasn't either. But I'm concerned that our strategy of looking, even though we're pulling together CPS data, these are small states. And so if you get some kind of weirdness going on there, so I think, I've started to look into the ACS to get bigger samples, not just by state, but thinking we can get maybe some MSA type of estimates. Of course, it's a different thing because the ACS is fundamentally different than the CPS. I'm not going to say much more about that, but I think people in the game kind of know that. So I think it does bear some looking into it, because what do other college workers do in Wyoming? I don't know, but it seems like maybe most of the college grads working in Wyoming are teachers. I'm not sure, right? So it is something that each and every state really deserves a deeper dive, because it would be great to actually see what the distribution is of the industry and occupational makeup and all of that. So I think there are some fair questions there. Although I would say over the many, when we really started to really do estimates of individual states, these three have always been the ones with the smallest. So it's not jumping wildly around from report to report, but I probably, it's just, again, there's some other moving parts that we haven't taken a close enough look at, I think. Oh, and by the way, I just wanted to really quickly, because, we're seeing that maybe teacher pay isn't moving scores the way we would like, as far as Eunice's work, but it's still important when we're talking about, the supply of teachers, right? And who's coming into the profession, who's leaving the profession, and teacher shortages every year in every state, for especially for STEM and math and those type of things. So even though it might not be moving things the way that we would think in Eunice's work, for instance, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are other reasons that are important here.
Okay, so going on to Sylvia's comments and answering to my own questions, my paper still shows that there is significant positive relationship between the two. Like higher paying districts perform better, but the extent of that magnitude is just kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
So if we're going to make a policy intervention based on this finding, I can't really make a strong suggestion, right? We should raise the teacher salary by so and so. But as Kate mentioned, we are probably stuck in some sort of a low quality equilibrium. So if you want to get out of that, you will have to pay teachers a lot more than 2% increase, and 3% increase is not going to do anything, right? Mm-hmm. If you give teachers $1,000 more or $200 more per month, it's not going to change anyone's mind to get into the teacher preparation program for that amount of money, right? So you will have to think about at least a 20% increase, right? I think the Sylvia's paper has a teacher wage penalty of 20% overall.
Yeah.
So, right. So
yeah, so that's not out of the realm of what
right
for anyway. At the least, because even the highest paid teachers were thinking there's a lot of talk that even recently I just heard, teacher pay should be in the six figures. And I think that's right. I think we need to go a long way to make it a profession. And
yeah.
But
yeah, so it's hard for any policymakers to make any decision based on this kind of finding, because typically the magnitude is small, but we really want to get something done, right? And especially on the education inequality, we know that the students in those disadvantaged districts are suffering, and we want to figure something out to help them. But everything we try is not really working, and it's kind of frustrating. And that's carried on my paper as well. I look at this and I look at that, and it's just not working. So what is going on here? And it's still a black box. So that gives you motivation to look for other channels, but that doesn't mean that we should give up on this higher pay, right? It's probably there, but the data that we have has very little variation because it's national data. We're not going to see much difference between states in terms of, well, I'm not going to move states to be a teacher, right? I'm going to be staying in the same state, but move around the districts if I want to be a teacher. So that's why I don't really see much variance itself in the teacher compensation. And my data is also at the district level. So that will be probably also the downside of the data using the district level, not the individual level.
Yeah, and that also makes me think is if you had more variance, that variability, that would the effect even be linear? Like, could you
That's
see,
right.
if we had if we were running an experiment, gave somebody like really high teacher pay, so that question really isn't being answered here. That if we really got serious, and again, what we're talking about, increasing teacher pay to the levels that you're saying, even with what you have, that would move scores, isn't out of the realm of what we actually should be doing.
That's right. So we actually have international evidence that we have a more variance in international countries. And then we do have several papers talking about positive association between teacher pay level and the student performance. Yeah. And yeah, based on that, we could probably run an experiment and give teachers 30% more, and then let's follow the outcome 30 years later. That will be a really cool experiment, right? Like a little star project. Yeah, so I'm still digging, and we should probably look at other outcome variables, as Kate mentioned.
Yeah.
Test score is so limited, right? We can look at the graduation rate, or even the college attendance rate or daily attendance rate, stuff like that. There are other outcome measures that we should look into, but we always go back to the test score and talk about that, right?
But I also think that the work of that Patrice and Jeff just presented is really adding to what we know, because the trend that you have, we would actually want to see it almost reversed, is what I was thinking, because it's like, well, it's like, well, wait a minute, we're always giving so much less to where it's really needed. And I was really intrigued by I don't know why this never really dawned on me. But the idea of just looking overall at school budgets might leave out important, information, especially if, so much of the extra school budget is just simply going to security costs. You're still then way, way behind, because you're not having all the other great stuff that the schools that are maybe equally funded, but not spending anything on security.
Right. So I think it's interesting, and it's a lot harder to work in the Abbott districts. Yeah. The working conditions are much more difficult, and so there's higher turnover there. And so in other fields, we might talk about compensating wage differentials. There should be some kind of, maybe if we're casting around for policy solutions, hazard pay for working in these districts. Yeah. And that might help draw some teachers and get them to actually stay in those districts. It would be, I think, and Jeff can chime in, it would be less controversial than trying to create regional schools or regional high schools. And our previous Republican governor was opposed to all teachers, but in general, the state tends to be more of a blue state, and there's a strong union presence. So that might be one policy option that would work, but I'd like to hear what Jeff's thoughts are on policy option.
I think you're right. It's, if I truly believed in compensating wage differentials, I always thought compensating wage differentials was a great theory in search of facts, given that the most dangerous jobs in America are always paid the least. Even with all else equal, whatever all else equal may mean in that circumstance. But yeah, it's very clear that there's very high turnover in these school districts. And again, anecdotally, what I hear is that the people we give tenure to are not the best and brightest by any stretch of the imagination. School districts, many of these school districts are just thankful to be able to hire and promote people. They don't have to be the best qualified or anything remotely like that. That staying and being there every day scores a lot of points. The tragedy here is that New Jersey has really made substantial efforts, and we still have such dramatic inequality. So the solutions are not obvious to me. Consolidation has certainly been on the agenda for every politician, Republican or Democrat. When they come in, that's what they say, well, that needs to be done first. And every one of them fails, remarkably. Now, one thing we could do is look at the state of Maryland, which socioeconomically has some of the very same problems that New Jersey has, and some of the same issues. And it's organized on the county level, right? The school system. It has a few of the, like Bethesda, Chevy Chase, wealthy school districts out there. But for the most part, Maryland is organized at the county level, and I'm not sure, I just never looked at the data closely enough to really figure out whether that helps or not. It should desegregate the schools at least, because that's the other thing that's very obvious in New Jersey is the level of segregation through home rule has just been remarkable to sustain segregation. And given the Supreme Court decisions, you can't force any school district to regionalize unless you can show that there's a deliberate intention to discriminate. So the court can't compel these school districts, even if they're perfectly segregated, to integrate. If they can't show, and they can't, that there was a deliberate effort to segregate these schools.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We're a little bit past time. I'm not sure exactly when Lyra will kick us off on Zoom, so if people want to stay and chat, feel free to do so. But thank you all so much for the great presentations and then the really thoughtful discussion afterwards.
Yeah, this was good. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Good to see you,
Thank
Jeff.
you.
Nice
Good to
to see
see
you guys.
everybody.
Eunice, thank you, Kate. Good to see you again, Larry.
You.
Great. How are you, Eunice?